Yeah, marhaba. Right now I want to take a little bit of a break from grammar to talk about something else. I want to talk about reading strategies, especially those that apply to intermediate and advanced level learners of Arabic, like you. If you're watching this video, you probably fall into one of those two categories. Of course, we're always approaching different texts in different ways, depending on a lot of factors, like how much time we have, whether we're seeking specific information or general comprehension from a text, whether or not we have dictionaries or other translation aids at our disposal, and things like that. The way you read your train schedule when you have 4 minutes to get from the platform is different from the way that you're going to approach fiction that you read for pleasure, and the way that you read an advertisement in a magazine is going to be different from the way that you approach a text that you're using for research, for writing a paper. What I'd like to do though is provide some suggestions for working on the texts that your instructors may assign you in Arabic class, either as homework or as in-class reading, in order to help you get the maximum benefit from them. So as a first step, when your eyes hit that page for the very first time, you just want to skim. You want to stop and think about what kind of text it is without concerning yourself too much with the specific language that's involved with the text. Is it a newspaper article? Is it an autobiographical blog post that's written in the first person? Or is it a fairy tale? It can be tempting to dive right into the words because that can feel faster. You want to get to the end because you have other homework to do and you only have so many hours in the day. But be sure to just stop and take a look for any other information that is being presented to you on the periphery of the language, right? If there are dates or pictures or URLs typed in English, for example, those can be really valuable in terms of knowing what kind of a text you're dealing with. And if you can determine just from the visual context that you're looking at a recent newspaper article, then you can use that understanding plus your knowledge of current events to contextualize what you're about to read. I can reasonably expect the who, what, when, where, why. If I'm looking at a newspaper article, I expect a certain kind of information to be presented. If I see colorful illustrations of kings and queens and horses and dragons, I might expect a completely different kind of text, right? Maybe I'm looking at a story from Alf Layla wa Layla, and I can expect magic and a narrative that's happening mostly in the past tense, and maybe words for specific creatures that I see on the page in the picture whose names I don't know yet, but using that context can wind up saving me a lot of time. So it's easy to forget this step, but be sure to take a look at the forest before you deal with the trees. Once you're done with that, then you can start scanning, moving your eyes in a slightly slower and more directed way. At this point, at the scanning stage, you're going to want to look for the familiar. You're not reading word by word. You're not worrying about grammar or vocabulary that seems unfamiliar, words you don't know. You're letting your eyes drift on the hunt for any information that can pop out and make itself immediately apparent to you. If you have a set of questions that you're supposed to answer as part of the assignment, you can mark or take a note about anything that leaps out at you and seems as though it might be useful for answering those questions later on, once you've done a couple more readings. Now is also a great time to focus on things like titles, headlines, or subheadings, and maybe pay a little extra attention to the first sentence, the lead sentence in every paragraph, right? That is going to be a place where we're gonna see a lot of new ideas presented, and it might even be a good idea to read just the first sentence of each paragraph to give you a quick and dirty summary of the kind of information that might be presented. If it's fiction, right, if it's a story narrative, then there might be more or less value to that, but you'll still get an idea of what is happening and the direction in which the narrative is proceeding. When you're done with that, it's a good idea to come up with some initial comprehension questions of your own to guide further reading. You might say, okay, I've seen this name or this proper noun in several different places, in several different paragraphs. What is the significance of that person or place? I still haven't been able to really situate it and figure out what its role is in terms of the information that's being presented to me. It's better to aim a little big with those questions too. At this point, try to make your questions about the level of ideas and less about, what does this word mean? That's a question, and it might be a good question, but now isn't the time to concern yourself with that minute level of detail. Always remember that your goal when you're reading a text is to seek information. So finally, after I've skimmed and I've scanned, I'm ready to do my initial readings. Skimming, scanning, reading, all slightly different activities with different goals, right? When I'm doing my initial reading, or hopefully my initial readings, plural, I'm going to do them without stopping. When you're doing this initial reading, try to read in chunks, in phrases, not just one word at a time, and to keep track of the main topic of each sentence. If I'm not getting every single word or every bit of information, that's okay, but I'm slowing down and seeking more specifics. At this point, I'm definitely not using a dictionary yet. You might make some marks for words that intrigue you or that you might want to investigate later, but you're not stopping to grab a dictionary or computer and look anything up, because at this point we're still on the hunt for all of the context that the text can provide. Once you get all the way to the end, you're going to want to head back to the beginning and do that second reading again. That might seem very basic, very obvious, maybe even a little bit silly or annoying as a suggestion. But the thing is that doing this first reading twice will enable you to re-examine the beginning of the text with all of the context that you got from the end. And you'll probably be surprised at how much additional comprehension you gain. Now is also a great time to keep a sharp lookout for familiar judur, those Arabic roots. They might enable you to successfully guess at the meaning of an unfamiliar word. Even if you don't know the word, you might recognize the judur from another word that you do know. And even if you're not quite sure what the meaning of the word is, it can help you come up with an intelligent hypothesis about what the ideas are that are being discussed. And then finally, at the end of that process of initial readings, I'm going to write some notes on what I think I understood and not worry about whether my hypotheses are 100% accurate yet. But I'm also going to check in with my initial questions and see if I can answer any of those questions and see if I can re-articulate any additional questions that I can use to guide me on my final close readings. You can't really do a close reading unless you are hunting for something specific. So once you move on to that rereading step, when you're doing your close readings, make it your goal to be looking again for specific information, right? This would be the first point at which I would consider using a dictionary, and I can target my efforts by focusing on the pieces of the text that I believe, based on my earlier steps in this process, are going to yield me more information and a deeper understanding. Remember that information is what we're after. If we learn some words or some grammar while we're doing a reading, then great, that's wonderful. But our main goal is to gain understanding. So I want to be very choosy with my dictionary use. You could, if you wanted, spend 12 hours looking up every word in the text, but during that time you're not necessarily gaining information from the text. You would wind up with a word list and then be very frustrated at the end because your comprehension hasn't really increased that much. You've got a vocab list, but that's not the same as gaining understanding of a piece of information. So I want to be very targeted. It can be useful, especially if you have other homework to do in a given day, to maybe give yourself a quota. If you have an hour and a half or 2 hours to look at a couple of pages of text, maybe decide, okay, I'm going to allow myself just 12 words with the dictionary or with an online translator of some sort, and I'm going to really want to select those words on the basis of the understanding that they give me. Maybe you recognize the judur, but you can't figure out what context it makes sense in, or maybe it's the only word in a sentence whose judur you don't recognize, or maybe it's the word that you see 8 times in the text that's completely unfamiliar but clearly really important. But always make sure you have a reason when you're looking up a word, and that reason is better than it's the first word I don't know, right? That will save you a lot of time and frustration, trust me. And then, at the end of that process, once we have taken a look at the clock and determined how much time we can spend on any dictionary use and really focused on which questions we want to answer, which information is still not readily available to us, that would be the time to answer those questions and maybe revise them. If you have any additional questions, articulate those to yourself before you dive in. And you can continue that process for as long as time allows, right? But at a certain point, it's a good idea to head on to the summary process, where it's going to be your goal to articulate in as much detail as possible what you understood. If you have comprehension questions, then it's a good idea to make your answers long, because in repeating that information to yourself and in writing it down or speaking it aloud if you're working in class with a classmate, the more detail you can provide, the more likely you are to remember it, and the more likely you are to be able to present that information and turn your passive understanding into active production, right? You're working on multiple skills at the same time. If you're writing at home before class, then it's a good idea to think of your written answers to these questions as preparation to speak in class. And similarly, if you're looking at a class cold, if you're looking at a text cold in a class with a classmate, then your conversation with that classmate is a great way to prepare yourself to do some writing, since you know your instructor is probably going to make you write on the topic that you're reading about at a certain point in time, right? So be conscious about the relationship of those two productive tasks to each other. Speaking is prep for writing, and writing is prep for speaking. Now, when you're answering questions, when you're articulating everything that you understood about a text, that's also a great time to prep any additional questions that you may have. And I say this because the more specific you can make your questions for a classmate once you get to class, or for an instructor who's going to be helping you in class, the more likely they are to be able to help you. If you point at a sentence and say, "I didn't understand a word of that," that's a statement, but it's not really a question that they can help you answer. But if you are looking at a specific sentence and you can identify what's still making understanding challenging for you, then if you can articulate that is a great way of having them help you. So you can say, okay, there's a list of different things in this sentence, and I understand the nouns, but I don't understand what the purpose of this verb at the beginning of the sentence is, and what its relationship is, or what the subject is. Can you help me figure that out? Or, can you help me understand the relationship between these two people that the text mentions in the same paragraph? They clearly have some kind of relationship to each other, but I don't understand exactly what they did together or what the nature of their adversarial relationship is. Can you help me understand that? What did you understand from that text? And those are questions that others in class, your instructor and your classmates, can help you answer. So time is precious, right? And it is perhaps not always possible to implement every single one of these steps in full for every text you're ever going to read in Arabic, or another language for that matter that you might be learning. However, especially with these initial steps, it's always a good idea to give yourself a little bit of time to consciously perform those actions, to make sure that you're allowing yourself the benefit of all the context that's provided, and especially coming up with questions and answering your questions and thinking about that consciously is such a helpful way for helping yourself squeeze some meaning out of a text. If anything from this video sticks with you, it's that articulating questions consciously and thinking about those questions and trying to answer your own questions is perhaps the best way to arrive at a real understanding of the text you happen to be dealing with.